Make sure the oil channel in the bottom bearing is clean and fully open. Fit the wing insert into the bottom bearing holder. Align the screw hole in the holder with the hole in the wing insert. Secure the screw with the Loctite 222. Fit the new O-rings on the bottom bearing holder. Lubricate only with the same oil as used in the oil sump. Fit the strainer onto the bottom bearing holder. Before fitting the bottom bearing holder into the frame, apply Loctite 222 onto the two surfaces directly above and under the upper O-ring. Fit the bottom bearing holder into the frame. Fit the special tool. Tighten the bottom bearing holder using a torque wrench. Always check the separator manual and additional service bulletins for correct torque. Remove the special tool from the bottom bearing holder. Lubricate with the same oil as used in the oil sump and fit a new labyrinth ring in the holder. Lubricate and fit the O-ring into the labyrinth holder. Treat the screws with Loctite 222 and fit the holder into the frame with the O-ring facing downwards. Fit and tighten the screws. The next step is to fit new bearings onto the spindle. New bearings are available in the Otherhaul kit. Prepare all the parts needed for the spindle assembly. Heat the top bearing seat to 80 degrees centigrade above the ambient temperature, but no more than 125 degrees centigrade. There are different ways to heat the bearings and bearing seat. We can use different kinds of induction heaters or heated oil. If you're using heated oil, make sure the vessel used to warm the oil is well cleaned and the oil is the same as used in the separator. Be careful not to overheat the oil. Use a thermometer and a hot plate. Do not use naked flame like an acetylene burner. Always use a new ball bearing. Make ready the correct bearing from the service kit. Be careful when handling heated parts. Always use protective gloves. Before fitting the new ball bearing to the top bearing seat, drop some oil onto the bearing using the same oil as in the oil sump on the separator. Fit the snap ring. Use the correct pliers to avoid accidental release. Fit the cap nut onto the spindle to protect the threads from damage during handling. Heat the top bearing seat together with the top bearing to a temperature of 80 degrees centigrade above the ambient temperature, but no more than 125 degrees centigrade. Be careful when handling heated parts. Use gloves. Before fitting the bearing and the bearing seat, be sure to clean the spindle and the tools, the puller and sleeve. Using dirty tools may result in a breakdown of the bearing because of the contamination from the tools. Use a wooden board to protect the spindle and the threads on the spindle from damage. Fit the bearing seat and the bearing to the spindle. We recommend 2 persons to carry out this operation. If the bearing doesn't fit immediately, fit the sleeve and puller and gently hammer the bearing into position. Get the new axial springs from the service kit and fit them into the recesses in the top bearing housing. Carefully lower the spindle into the top bearing housing. Position the vibration indicator into the recess in the top bearing housing. Make sure the axial springs enter into the recesses in the top bearing seat. Before fitting the new composite springs, make sure to lubricate the springs and the threads on the plug with the same oil as used in the separator. Fit the springs and make sure they fit well into the recess in the top bearing seat. Fit the plugs and tighten them by hand. The final tightening of the plugs is done when the assembly is in the frame. Make sure the cap nut is mounted onto the spindle and rest the spindle assembly on the wooden support. Make sure there is at least 1 millimeter clearing between the support and the spindle assembly to protect the upper bearing during the assembly of the lower bearing. Clean the spindle and the spindle pulley before assembly. Fit the spindle pulley onto the spindle. Before fitting the lower bearing, make sure you clean the drift tool and hammer. Using dirty tools may result in breakdown of the bearing due to contamination by the tools. Heat the bearing to at least 30 degrees centigrade and no more than 50 degrees centigrade. Lubricate the bearing before fitting it to the spindle. Use the drift tool and hammer to secure the bearing to the spindle. The next step is to mount the oil fan. Lubricate the bearing before mounting the fan with the same oil as used in the separator. Lubricate the O-ring with oil and mount it onto the fan. Lubricate the threads on the fan and using the tool, fit it by hand only. Lubricate the O-ring with oil and mount it onto the oil orifice. Fit the oil orifice into the pump and make sure to push it all the way down. Lubricate the threads onto the spindle with oil and fit the pump. Tighten the pump using a torque wrench. Check with the manual and additional service bulletins for the correct torque for your machine. Treat the nozzle threads with Loctite 222 from the kit and fit it onto the oil pump. Lubricate the threads on the spindle with oil and fit the pump. Tighten the pump using a torque wrench. Check with the manual and additional service bulletins for the correct torque for your machine. Fit the air deflector and screws and tighten by hand. Use gloves. There are sharp edges on the air deflector. The air deflector design may be different than the one shown here. Remove the cap nut and fit the lifting tool onto the spindle. Carefully check the holes in the oil pump to make sure that nothing is blocking them. Before mounting the spindle in the frame, fit a new belt. Make sure the frame is cleaned before mounting the belt. Make sure the belt is mounted in the correct way. Please observe the arrow marking. Secure room for the spindle around the lower bearing holder so that the belt is not damaged. Carefully lower the drive assembly into the frame. Do not rotate the spindle assembly during lifting. The spindle assembly may otherwise separate from the lifting tool. If the lower bearing is not aligned correctly and the spindle assembly is not fitting correctly, try to rotate the spindle and the assembly will fall into place. Never hammer down the spindle assembly if it doesn't fall into place. This will damage the bearings and bearing holder. Remove the tool from the spindle. Refit the cap nut to protect the threads during assembly. Fit and tighten the spindle assembly screws to the frame. Tighten the plugs firmly. Prepare all the parts needed for mounting the centrifugal clutch, new bearings, snap rings and friction blocks. Slip the belt pulley over the coupling hub and place them onto a firm and level foundation. Apply a thin film of oil onto the external and internal surfaces of the ball bearings. Press the ball bearings down one at a time into the coupling hub using the special tool. Don't forget the spacing ring between the bearings. Mount the two snap rings holding all the parts together. Check for free movement of the bearings. Make sure the motor spindle is clean before mounting the centrifugal clutch. Lubricate with a thin coating of oil. Check that the key is in the groove on the shaft. Mount the centrifugal clutch onto the motor spindle. The centrifugal clutch is heavy and may fall, causing injury if it comes off the motor shaft. Use some Molykote to lubricate the threads on the tool. Remove the brass plug and fit the screw onto the tool. Fit the tool to the motor spindle using an extension rod and a socket. Use the correct size spanner to pry the centrifugal clutch onto the motor spindle. Remove the tool again. Mount the spring washer and washer. Secure it with the screw and tighten it. The centrifugal clutch is now secured to the motor spindle. Fit the friction blocks to the clutch. 5 friction blocks for 50 Hz and 3 friction blocks for 60 Hz. Fit the cover and secure it with the snap ring. The centrifugal clutch and motor are now ready to mount onto the separator again. Lift the motor and fit it to the frame. Insert the screws and tighten slightly. Do not turn the spindle until the motor is tightened properly to the frame. This will damage the belt. Remove the lifting tools from the motor. Fit the belt onto the motor belt pulley. Tighten the screws on the motor. When the motor is secured to the frame, start turning the motor belt pulley. This will center the belt onto the pulley. Check that the spindle belt is running freely on the spindle pulley so that the belt is not damaged. Fit a new seal ring in the neck bearing cover. Lubricate the O-ring and fit it. Lubricate and fit the O-ring on the deflector ring. Make a mark on the cover where the guide screw is and on the frame where the hole for the guide is. This will make the assembly easier. Carefully fit the cover into the frame. Make sure the cover is correctly fitted. Fit the deflector ring onto the spindle. Depending on the size of the separator, there are different designs on the deflector ring. Follow the instructions in the service manual for your separator. Remove the O-ring from the water inlet pipe. Fit the seal ring on the operating water cover. Lubricate and fit the O-ring onto the cover. Lubricate and fit a new O-ring onto the water inlet pipe. Make sure the hole for the water inlet is fitted to the water inlet pipe. Fit the cover and tighten the screws firmly. Fit the shorter screw into the 2 holes used to loosen the cover. We should always measure the spindle wobble after the machine has been overhauled. The maximum wobble allowed is 0.04 millimeters. Fit a new washer to the plug in the oil sump and fit the plug. Fill up the sump with oil. Make sure you use the correct oil. See the service manual for the correct type of oil. Always fill oil with the upper plug removed. Fill until the oil comes out from the upper hole. Allow some time for the excessive oil to come out before fitting the upper plug in the frame. Fit a new washer to the upper plug and tighten.